My name is Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome back if you're a regular attendee of our programs, and I want to extend a hearty welcome as well if you're joining us for one of our public programs for the first time today. Today marks the start of a new three-part series to focus for a few weeks on race, or critical race studies, or critical race theory. That is, we'll think together for 3 sessions about the ways race or ideas of race can be a fruitful lens through which to look at Jewish history, and simultaneously how unique elements of Jewish history can expand and inform the very active conversations happening today about the role race has played in shaping our world and continues to do so. In turning to this topic, we're building on a very popular series of talks from last spring. That series was called Jews, Race, and Religion, and it was also held over Zoom webinar. And if you're interested in the topic, you can find all of those lectures recorded. They're on the Katz Center's YouTube channel, and there should be a link to that channel in the chat. I see that it's there. Today's talk will also be posted there in a few days as well, should you want to share it or watch it again. With our move into this series, we're also stepping temporarily away from our ongoing series on historical approaches to canonical Jewish legal texts. So over the past few weeks, we learned about the Mishnah and the Talmud. And that series will resume with 2 more talks in January, one on the Mishneh Torah and one on the Shulchan Aruch. There is information about those talks already up on our website, so do keep that in mind if you're interested in that topic. And those talks are also on YouTube. Before we start, as always, I very much want to acknowledge the Klatt family and the Harry Stern Family Foundation, whose gifts have long supported our public programming. And we also have a group of supporters called the Friends of the Katz Center who have come together to help ensure that we can continue to make programs like this accessible to so many people. A link to more information about that group is in the chat. And on behalf of the Katz Center's director, Steve Weitzman, and Associate Director, Natalie Dorman, I want to say we are so grateful to the Friends group and other individual donors. Finally, deep thanks to my colleagues, Diana Dennis-Walters, Brian Lipscomb, and Dr. Becky Friedman, who do almost everything behind the scenes to get you and me and our speakers here together in this virtual space. As always, the talk will run for about 40 minutes, and afterwards I'll moderate the Q&A for our remaining time. Please feel welcome to post your questions at any time during the hour using the Q&A button found at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I will do my best to communicate your questions to our speaker at the end. I see that we are already well over 100 participants today, so there's a chance that I will not be able to read out your question directly, but hopefully we'll get a great discussion going. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Dorothy Kim for our first speaker in this series. Dr. Kim comes to us from the English department at Brandeis University. There she teaches medieval literature, including issues of race, gender, and Jewish-Christian difference. She also studies and teaches about book history and the digital humanities, the archive and the media and the alt-right. And you can sort of think about where all of those things converge. I think that's where we're going to be in today's talk. She is the author or editor or co-editor of a large number of books. I'll just mention a couple of them. One of them is The Alt-Medieval, Digital Whiteness and Medieval Studies. One of them is Global Medieval Digital Humanities. And most recently in progress is a work called Jewish-Christian Entanglements, Onkonowissa and its Material Worlds. That I think that material will connect very closely with what today's talk is about. And finally, I'm told late breaking news, there's a volume being released tomorrow, which is the 3rd volume of the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Race series. It's the volume treating 1350 to 1550, co-edited with Kim Coles, and there's a section there on pre-modern intersectionality. So you should be able to find that through a library starting tomorrow if you want to learn more about this topic. Now, I'll just turn things over to Dr. Kim to kick us off.
Thanks again, everyone, and the Cat Center for inviting me. I'm just gonna get started and share my screen. I have a Prezi, so hold on one second. Okay. I just want to make sure if you can see the.
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So, all right. So this is a talk about intersectionality and the medieval archive. I begin today thinking about the stakes of critical race theory now after last night's election and how the far right and Republican politics have used critical race theory as a racist dog whistle. I want to lay out a general definition of CRT, something I wish all journalists would ask politicians to explain before these politicians use CRT as a racist moral panic smokescreen. Critical race theory was theorized in legal theory and law journals after the civil rights movement to explain how structural racism worked within institutions, and especially the structures of US law, to systematically create inequity and often harm in these systems to racialized groups in contrast to the white hegemony. In addition, I will be discussing today racialized anti-Semitism, a term coined by Charles Mills. Oops, hold on. Oh, that did not want to do that. Sorry. Hold on. I'm just having a slight problem with the Prezi. Oops, here we go. All right. Oops. Didn't want to get to the beginning. All right. There. Charles Mill, so a term coined by Charles Mill, he discussed this in his article, The Chronopolitics of Racial Time. In this piece, he explains, he discusses race, the longue durée histories of the global North, and particularly how Western European temporality was organized by white Christian chronopolitics. Mills identifies racialized anti-Semitism as both erupting in instances during the European Middle Ages and also during the Nazi regime in Germany, culminating in genocide and Holocaust. In my talk today, which is taken from a chapter in the Cultural History of Race on pre-modern critical intersectionality, the series and book I co-edited, and this chapter will be published on Thursday. I will be discussing the theory of intersectionality as it has been explained in critical race theory by Kimberly Crenshaw in several legal journals. I will then use a case study of 13th century medieval England, what Geraldine Heng has identified as one of the first racialized states in medieval Europe, because there was an almost total government and institutional, in this case, the Catholic Church, surveillance system of racialized anti-Semitism that systematically segregated, discriminated, violently harmed, killed, and eventually expelled Jews from England by legal decree in 1290. My case studies are two sets of intertwined legal cases that work through the English court systems, as critical race theory has been theorized through legal theory in law journals and also eventually developed in education theory. These examples, I believe, best reveal how critical race theory and specifically intersectionality can be a useful tool to analyze the pre-modern medieval archive. Intersectionality was coined by the Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. When Crenshaw coined the term, she applied it specifically to US law and sought to explain the intersection of race and gender through, quote, a Black feminist criticism, unquote, because, quote, it sets forth a problematic consequence of the tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis, unquote. Since much of critical race theory is often developed in the field of law, specifically to address legal structures and systems, the theoretical development in relationship to anti-discrimination law is not a surprise. Likewise, she points to the fields of, quote, feminist theory and anti-racist politics, unquote, to clarify the other areas that must contend with intersectionality and move beyond a single axis framework. What Crenshaw proposes instead is to examine structural methodology with a multi-axis framework. Importantly, her study reveals how single-axis frameworks cannot account for Black women's experience of the law. Quote, with Black women as a starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. I want to suggest further that this single axis framework erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experience of otherwise privileged members of the group. In other words, in race discrimination cases, discrimination tends to be viewed in terms of sex or class privileged Blacks. In sex discrimination cases, the focus is on race and class privileged women, unquote. In other words, Crenshaw notes the historical systematic erasure of Black women in the legal archive as a function of methodology. Specifically, she argues Black women are rendered invisible in the archive when our discussions of gender fail to consider race and when our discussions of race fail to consider gender. The theory of intersectionality goes back further in Black feminist queer discourse. With the work of the Combahee River Collective, the CRC called on prevailing feminist and racial justice movements to account for the unique experience of Black and queer women. The CRC laid out their political goals and theoretical praxis in 1977 in the Combahee River Collective statement, in which they first discussed identity politics. The CRC articulated its argument within a compelling genealogy of theorists and activists, including Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, Demita Fraser, and Kimberly Crenshaw, to name a few. The collective underscored the centrality of what Crenshaw calls compounded harm in an intersectional analysis or politics, the idea that, quote, multiple oppressions reinforce each other to create new categories of suffering, unquote. Keeanga-Yamada Taylor writes in further detail about the Combahee River Collective's theorization of oppression in her book, How We Get Free, quote, the CRC described oppressions as interlocking or happening simultaneously, thus creating new measures of oppression and inequality. In other words, Black women could not quantify their oppression only in terms of sexism or racism or of homophobia experienced by Black lesbians. They were not ever a single category, but it was the merging or enmeshment of these identities that compounded how Black women experienced oppression, unquote. These discussion of Crenshaw's and the Combahee River Collective's work highlight the main tenets of intersectionality, multi-axis frameworks and interlocking oppressions, leading to what Crenshaw calls compounded harm. There seems to be a regular mistake made by medievalists who worked in feminism to imagine that the experience of interlocking oppression is akin to stacking Legos, that oppression can be detached and reassembled to form identities. The reality is that these identity markers, especially race, are mutually constructed and mutually reinforcing. The Lego approach leads to false equivalence fallacies. Instead, to speak about feminism is to then speak about Black feminism, to speak about disability is to then speak about Black feminist disability, to speak about LGBTQIA is to speak about Black transgender lives and structural oppressions. It is not enough to discuss marginalization when foregrounding intersectionality. Instead, race must always be at the center of such conversations. Whiteness as a category necessarily can and should be interrogated if it is the only racial identity present. Connections between categories is simply not enough. Generally, an approach that centers pre-modern critical intersectionality in discussing gender is quite rare in medieval studies. Finally, following Margot Hendricks' discussion of pre-modern critical race studies, versus pre-modern race theory, something she presented at Race Before Race, Periodicity in 2019. I would like to distinguish between the work of pre-modern critical intersectionality and pre-modern intersectionality. One part of this new pre-modern critical race studies work is to consider critical genealogies that decenter whiteness. In critical race studies work, earlier genealogies in feminist studies, and particularly Black feminism, have pointed to this problem. Gabrielle Foreman explains the academic move of whiteness in the following way in relationship to Black studies. Quote, Non-Black academics and graduate students, like non-gay or non-Indigenous scholars, for example, have rightly found the critical paradigms, frameworks, and texts that have emerged in the last 40 years to be persuasive, exciting, and foundational. These scholars often delve into what's cutting edge and academically sexy, what appears to them to be uncharted waters, virgin land ripe for discovery and conquest. They are often too privileged and encouraged, too rewarded and reluctant to realize that to be responsibly trained, contributors need to grapple with a discipline's genealogy, background, and long history of serious scholarship, and to understand what Toni Morrison calls its structures, moorings, and anchors, unquote. Foreman highlights the settler colonial logics of whiteness's belief in its inalienable right to colonize areas of study. You can take her points and think about this in relationship to pre-modern critical race studies. Centering the whiteness of the genealogy is to literally dislodge the longer genealogy of this work that has been done by Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars who have been attendant to the longer genealogies of critical race theory. Finally, these genealogies are important in relationship to the pre-modern archive because so much of white critical theory, especially in relationship to gender and sexuality studies, is predicated on a white European gaze, or what Michael Hamas Garcia points to in Walter Mignolo's decolonial work in early modern studies as, quote, the colonial difference, unquote. The temporal pre-modern and a rigorous reckoning and working on pre-modern critical intersectionality are important interlocutors in this conversation. Why do we not imagine that all gender and sexuality studies work should be done through the lens of intersectionality? Or are we imagining that whiteness is not a racial category that must be reckoned with? Is it even possible to work through any kind of pre-modern gender studies without thinking about race, sexuality, class, disability, and how they will interlock? Especially in relationship to pre-modern critical intersectionality, which is also filled with additional added complexities, because the different identities that we are discussing are all in contextual flux, beholden to local conditions, geographies, and frictions. Theoretically, the work of pre-modern gender and sexuality studies must always use the method of pre-modern critical intersectionality, unless pre-modern scholars do not want to be involved in current gender and sexuality studies research. Otherwise, as Crenshaw states, quote, it sets forth a problematic consequence of the tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis, unquote. It becomes a single axis framework that already ignores the issues of intersectional identities and compounded harms. Within discussions of intersectionality, Taylor's reassessment of the Combahee River Collective and Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism provide useful avenues to think through the pre-modern archive. Taylor's discussion of the importance of the Combahee River Collective also highlights another point in relation to the use of the term identity politics, and how pre-modern critical intersectionality must understand that the issues of intersecting oppressions are not theoretical but material. Taylor writes, quote, the CRC identified their recognition of this political tension as identity politics. The CRC statement is believed to be the first text where the term identity politics is used. Since 1977, that term has been used, abused, and reconfigured into something foreign to its creators. The CRC made two key observations in their use of identity politics. The first was that oppression on the basis of identity, whether it was racial, gender, class, or sexual orientation identity, was a source of political radicalization. Black women were not radicalized over abstract issues of doctrine. They were radicalized because of the ways that their multiple identities opened them up to overlapping oppression and exploitation, unquote. I highlight this point first to underscore that to discuss pre-modern critical intersectionality is to discuss politics in relation to the material harms done to people as they live within intersectional oppressions. This is not a theoretical discussion. It has material consequences, effects, and impacts. It is not a game. It is often about life or death, also known as necropolitics. It should also be seen as a form of social theory in relationship to political and social resistance, both in the world and also in academia. Pre-modern critical intersectionality situates its theoretical in the material turn of both gender studies, critical race studies, and sexuality. In fact, one of its genealogies is then a move away from the linguistic turn, so emphatically a part of the white canon of queer theory vis-a-vis Judith Butler's work, to the material turn. This is elegantly laid out in Stacey Alamo and Susan Hackman's Introduction, Emerging Models of Materiality in Feminist Theory. This intertwines with the material genealogy of critical race theory that loops in Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Winters, Alexander Wailea, and Catherine McKittrick. It also considers the long entwined genealogies laid out here as part of the conversation to examine the pre-modern past in order to do the work of intersectional feminist resistance, repair, and radical praxis. This is the only way I see work in the pre-modern archive that will do justice to the political work of gender, race, and sexuality now. So moving into my case studies. So the first case study, and I call this section Jewish Women and English Legal Secular Courts, A Tale of Two Wives. This case study involves two Jewish women whose lives were deeply intertwined with each other in 13th century England. I will approach the study through documentary evidence in English secular and Christian religious court cases. In general, the plea rolls of the Exchequer of the Jews assiduously documented the legal disputes in relationship to Jews and has an archive of material related to Jewish women. This is separate from their involvement in medieval English Jewish courts, which mostly addressed family law. Though this section will focus on pre-modern critical intersectionality and the original legal heft of the formulation in relationship to Crenshaw's work and others on how it is seen in law, the comparison of having both Jewish and secular English courts adjudicate Jewish conflict is a good lens to see how pre-modern critical intersectionality can be used as a lens to discuss compounded harm in relationship to Jewish women. Geraldine Heng has explained both in England and the Jews and the invention of race in the European Middle Ages, how England, through the machinery of its structural bureaucracy and state, enacted one of the first racialized systems in relationship to English Jews in 12th and 13th century England. Jewish women had intersectional identities involving their racialized religion and their gender in medieval 13th century England. Both of Kimberly Crenshaw's early articles on intersectionality, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics, and Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color are useful interlocutors into the case of Muriel of Oxford and Lucretia of Winchester. Both women were married to David of Oxford in the first half of the 13th century. Muriel was, quote, probably born into a learned family in Lincoln, unquote, where she married David of Oxford. They relocated to Oxford in circa 1217 and worked in relation to the family business as accounted in several legal deeds. David of Oxford was one of the richest Jewish men in 13th century England. Quote, by 1240, David was a major figure in the Anglo-Jewish community, both locally and nationally, accounting for many loans to powerful political figures, unquote. However, though Muriel had financial privilege while married to David and participated in business transactions, she also was at a marital disadvantage since she never gave birth to a child. This childless state precipitated a legal court battle that traversed both Jewish court and the English secular court. David pursued a divorce in the Jewish court and was successful in acquiring a get, probably in 1240 on the grounds of infertility. Muriel refused this divorce and countersued because she did not give consent as per Jewish Talmudic law, and she pursued a bet din judgment from the local Oxford rabbi Jacob and the rabbis Moses from London and Aaron from Canterbury. She and her allies appeared to have had enough power and networks within the English Jewish community to also obtain further opinions from French rabbis on the case. As a Jewish woman with some family sort of networks, Muriel was at first able to work the levers of legal response within the Jewish court. However, the secular English court stepped in when David convinced the royal curia, which was sitting at Winchester, to intervene in 1242. Walter de Grey, Archbishop of York, fulfilled David of Oxford's expressed wishes, but then in the process not only stripped Muriel of her rights within a Jewish legal context, but also declared a complete ban on Jewish divorce from England. Muriel and her male supporters were summoned to the royal curia and interrogated about their request for French Jewish legal opinion during this process. The Archbishop handed David of Oxford the right to divorce and to remarry who he wished. He ended up marrying Lucretia of Winchester, who immediately produced a son before David of Oxford's death in 1244. So yes, incredibly intertwined. The complexities of this case reveal how a single axis framework cannot work in analyzing the moods, nuances, and outcomes of Muriel of Oxford's divorce. In Crenshaw's Demarginalization, the Intersection of Race and Sex, she discusses several cases that fail in court to address both the intersection of race and gender in relationship to anti-discrimination. She writes about several Title VII cases that cannot address the compounded harms of intersectionality, such as the De Graffenried versus General Motors case in 1976. Quote, in De Graffenried, 5 Black women brought suit against General Motors, alleging that employer seniority system perpetuated the effects of past discrimination against Black women. Evidence adduced at trial revealed that General Motors simply did not hire Black women prior to 1964, and that all of the Black women hired after 1970 lost their jobs in a seniority-based layoff during a subsequent recession. The district court granted summary judgment for the defendant, rejecting the plaintiff's attempt to bring suit not on behalf of Blacks or women, but specifically on behalf of Black women, unquote. In Muriel of Oxford's case, a single axis framework addresses only how the legal systems discriminate against her because of gender. In the divorce case, one can track how gender puts her on inequitable footing in the Jewish legal court and her counterclaim pursuit on grounds of her rights of consent within Jewish rabbinical legal frames about marriage and childlessness. However, the English Christian court's intervention into this high-profile Jewish family court case reveals that one cannot analyze Muriel in relation to a single-axis lens as an issue of gender only, nor as only an issue based on race-religious difference. Instead, the intersection of race and gender is the only way to analyze her case through a multi-axis lens. What the outcome also demonstrates, since the English Archbishop then proceeds to ban this option available in Jewish legal court, is the compounded effect and impact not just on Muriel of Oxford, but for subsequent other Jewish legal cases that would have involved a Jewish divorce. The effect of this divorce on Muriel of Oxford's life would culminate in the last documentary evidence we have of her through another court filing. In this case, this was again a case in the English court, though secular this time. You can see this in the close rolls of the English Exchequer. In 1253, a case is made against Muriel of Oxford because of her house's disrepair, whose living she received as a settlement in the divorce. At this point, her landlord, because of David of Oxford's death, is Lucretia of Winchester, who inherited the house. Muriel of Oxford appears to have sunken into a state of diminished financial means, if not poverty, for her to be unable to make repairs on the house she is living in. Pre-modern critical intersectionality reveals how poverty and basic needs are issues for women at the intersection of gender, race, and class. So the next case, and we have heard a little bit about her, is actually about Lucretia of Winchester, David of Oxford's second wife. And I should probably give contact warning here because we are going to discuss femicide. So in this section's second example, though Lucretia Winchester is astoundingly wealthy since she was married first, widowed, and then inherited her husband's estate before she married David of Oxford, this does not mean the issue of gender and race did not impact her relationship to compounded harms. Lucretia's name is prominent in the English records because of the multiple business and legal cases that she was involved in. However, what we will examine now is the last legal case connected to her name, her murder case. In Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color, Kimberly Crenshaw addresses one of the pressing issues and discussions around intersectionality, violence against Black, Indigenous women of color. She writes, quote, "My objective here is to advance the telling of that location by exploring the race and gender dimensions of violence against women of color. Contemporary feminist and anti-racist discourses have failed to consider the intersections of racism and patriarchy. Focusing on two dimensions of male violence against women, battering, and rape, I consider how the experiences of women of color are frequently the product of intersecting patterns of racism and sexism, and how these experiences tend not to be represented within the discourse of either feminism or anti-racism," unquote. Lucretia of Winchester was at home with her Christian maidservant Alice of Bicton in 1277 when a possible burglary resulted in their murder. The English 1275 statute of Jewry forbade the cohabitation of Christians with Jews, though Lucretia clearly ignored this law. Her daughter Abelia found their bodies. The court case describes the scene, quote, Lucretia, the Jewess, and Alice of Bicton, her servant, were found killed in the house of the same Lucretia, each having a blow to the chest made by a knife to the heart, unquote. Her daughter and 12 other witnesses gave testimony at the murder trial. Their testimony explained that, quote, one Ralph of Cheshire, a saddler of Winchester, had killed Lucretia and Alice and had immediately fled, unquote. Though the testimonies indicated one suspect, Ralph of Cheshire, others were accused of the crime and subsequently cleared, though during a jury hearing. These men, Roger Lescure, Ada Leseller, John Lesclotier, also named Ralph Leseller, presumably this was the original suspect, also named Ralph Leseller. Presumably this was the original suspect, since his name means the saddler as the murderer, as we've discussed with the murderer. Scholars have discussed how no one was indicted for Lucretia's and Alice's murder, even though two of her sons tried to file a murder charge against Roger Leseller. This case failed, and Lucretia and Alice's murderers never received justice. In an intersectional approach, I believe the only way to adequately address the murder and its subsequent failed indictments is to consider Lucretia as the main target and Alice as the other murdered women. Though multiple witnesses identified and gave testimony to the guilt of Ralph Leseller, there were a dozen witnesses. None of the testimony, whether they were Jewish or Christian witnesses, appeared to be enough to indict the consistently accused suspect, Ralph Leseller, of these homicides. We might consider this as a case of, in Crenshaw's words, structural intersectionality. Structural intersectionality is described as the ways in which the location of women of color at the intersection of race and gender make our actual experience of domestic violence, rape, and remedial reform qualitatively different than that of white women, unquote. In this instance, though Lucretia of Winchester's class status as one of the wealthiest Jewish women in 13th century England does not immure her to the intersecting issues of gender and race, and how that situates her murder in the murder of her Christian maidservant by the purported Christian man, Ralph Leseller, and her family's inability to receive appropriate justice for this double homicide and home invasion. It is impossible to analyze this case in relationship to just a single axis framework of just race, and in this case, Jewish ratio-religious difference or gender. It can only be unpacked with a discussion of structural intersectionality, the compounded harms of race and gender, and how how that is worked through the English secular legal system and its inability, even with over a dozen witness testimonies, to indict a Christian man for these heinous crimes. These identity politics and situational power issues local to Winchester are the only avenue in which to appropriately tease out this violent legal case. David of Oxford's two wives, Muriel of Oxford and Lucretia of Winchester, are examples of how pre-modern critical intersectionality can be applied through legal court cases, but with different angles. In the case of Muriel of Oxford, we see how her inability to advocate for her marriage rights pushes her into poverty, and also how the English legal system disenfranchises her rights as a Jewish woman and enacts compounded harm that affects the rest of her life. In regards to Lucretia of Winchester, we see how even though she has vast financial resources and a deep network of powerful family members, it did not stop what seems to be racialized gendered violence to end her life and the life of Alice, her live-in servant. Her family's inability to obtain justice through the English courts only highlights the inequitable system that allows over a dozen witness testimonies to be insufficient to bring Ralph Leseller to trial or indict anyone for this double homicide and burglary. So in conclusion, Patricia Hill Collins discusses intersectionality as a social theory, and particularly the importance of how critical intersectionality helps to understand and unpack how power works. Quote, many intellectual histories overlook the importance of power relations in shaping the questions, assumptions, knowledge, and the impact of a given social theory. Intersectionality itself can be seen as a knowledge project of resistance, one in which critical analysis underpins its intellectual resistance. Intersectionality also confronts epistemological challenges to its intellectual resistance. Particularly, knowledge projects are sites of intellectual resistance, and critical social theory is a particular form of intellectual resistance, unquote. Collins' recent work explains the consequences of working on intersectionality. Quote, if practitioners do not pursue intersectionality's critical theoretical possibilities, it could become just another form of, as a friend of mine put it, academic bullshit that joins an arsenal of projects that progressive and radical potential has waned. Quote, this then is an activist scholarly praxis that focuses on pushing for social change. Pre-modern critical intersectionality is an important part of the project since the pre-modern archive has become such a central node in enacting compounded harm onto Black and Indigenous women of color. And our task as scholars in the pre-modern must be to help dislodge these pre-modern weapons that uphold white supremacy and colonial violence and fantasies of white heritage. In addition, recent discussion of intersectionality points to the importance of making central the issues of the most vulnerable and to highlight issues of access to basic needs, poverty, hunger, and in the ethos of the discussions of intersectionality, centering the most marginalized to lift all. Miki Kendall's book, Hood Feminism, especially highlights the importance of focusing on basic needs. This requires scholars of the pre-modern to forego critiques of constantly valorizing white women as possessors of power. Power to do what? In a case study that examines white women is a case study that examines elite white women having power intersectional? Can it be? Are elite women having power a form of intersectionality? I will remind the audience here that the Virginia elections last night and their statistics suggest that over 10+% swing of white women with voting power moved from backing the Democrats, who backed the Democrats last year, to supporting the Republican governor, Youngkin, the candidate who used CRT as a wedge and had the enthusiastic support of Donald Trump. If discussing women having white power or white representation is part of second wave feminism, then why is it still the theoretical bulwark in our pre-modern gender and sexuality studies scholarship? Kendall's answer to these questions are clear. Instead of prestige and royal power, she asks us to consider thinking about food insecurity and sex work, for example, as fundamentally feminist issues. These ideas are echoed in Kianga Yamada Taylor's reassessment of the power of the Combahee River Collective and their statement in her book, How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, quote, but identity politics was not just about who you were, it was also about who you could do or what you could do to confront the oppression you were facing. Or as Black women had argued within the broader feminist movement, the personal is political. This slogan was not just about lifestyle issues as it came to be popularly understood. Rather, it was initially about how the experience within the lives of Black women shaped their political outlook. The experience of oppression, humiliations, and the indignities created by poverty, racism, and sexism opened Black women up to the possibility of radical and revolutionary politics, unquote. It's this emphasis on critical intersectionality to focus on the issues of most need, poverty, sexual violence, labor, class, sexuality, disability, race, as intersecting and enmeshed issues that will allow us to think about critical intersectionality as a work of not just theory and self-reflection, but praxis. Pre-modern critical intersectionality is how pre-modern critical race, gender, sexuality studies can be used to discuss and mesh identity politics related to class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, disability. It is a multi-axis pre-modern critical lens that, quote, can help rethink specific contextual research and teaching projects, unquote. This talk has also been about re-examining intersectional method and theory to address fluctuating and in-process medieval identity politics. I hope that my discussion today also had the added effect of allowing people to consider how pre-modern critical intersectionality as praxis related to community, politics, and resistance. The examples of Muriel of Oxford and Lucretia of Winchester are different contextual cases in the pre-modern archive that can explain the legal maneuvers of different courts, highlight how pre-modern critical intersectionality is crucial to understand how white Christian hegemonic law upholds structural intersectionality and enacts compounded harms. Thank you. I think we are ready for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. If you stop sharing your screen, then we'll be able to see each other better. That's great. All right, so we do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to try to sort of organize them into some categories. In the first place, there were some questions stemming from the first part of your talk that really very helpfully laid out what critical race theory is and who are the most important theorists of it, both in its formation and as it continues to be practiced today. So there are some questions sort of just about that framework. And one of them is the following: do critical race theorists see intersecting features as additive? That is, do race and gender and religion or age or ethnicity each add the same amount of burden? So that sounds like more like the Lego model maybe. But also relative to each other, do they are they weighted differently, and how are individual situations and individual combinations taken into account?
I think the critical race theory material really focused on US law, right? So I think if people understand that this is really where it sort of generated its theoretical lens from, and still does, if you do work on critical race theory, you end up spending a lot of time reading law journals, which is very different than I think what people think, like, laid out in very specific legalese, if that makes sense, in some specific ways. It also then developed into the other area that it really developed was in after legal theory was actually in education, in sort of education theory. So those are the two areas that really kind of ran with kind of developing ways to think about critical race theory, and specifically in relationship to US law. And I think if people understand that, they can understand that in relationship to US law, yes, at the moment, race is, the most harmful, right? And you can think about it both in terms of settler colonialism and indigenous sort of genocide and dispossession. You can also think about it as a longer history of chattel slavery and sort of structural anti-Blackness and that, right? I think if you understand that, and if you take it out and you think then in different locations and contexts, who is in the hegemony, what are the various racialized groups, and how those institutional structures are in place may change. And I think the pre-modern archive is actually really interesting to think about some of this, because depending on location and context and period and geographies and factors, this changes. One of the other examples I used in the article about pre-modern intersectionality is actually work that Roland Betancourt has done in relationship to the Byzantine Empire. And what I find really interesting about his work, I'm working on the sort of far west regions of medieval Europe, right? So that margin, and he's working on the other end. But in the Byzantine Empire, race and sexuality are intertwined differently, right? And that compounded harm cannot happen without the gender, if that makes sense. Like the gender actually is what structures the intersectionality issue. So again, I think it really depends. I think you're going to have to kind of evaluate some of those factors. And what you have to understand is that, yes, the critical race theory is coming from really generating, work from like the 70s forward out of US law. And so they're thinking about the context and particularities of US law, right? And what is the sort of frame outs there. But if you think about what they're discussing, you can kind of move out and look at then the context and frameworks in various locations and think about then, well, what does the material tell me, right? And I think one of the reasons I think the sort of court cases of these two wives are really, really interesting is because they are exactly in the arena of where CRT really sort of develops out by looking at these court cases and pointing these kind of problems out. This is how CRT actually sort of developed, right? Like Crenshaw is basically saying, what do you mean they didn't get a discrimination suit? Because they said they were discriminated as Black women, but they would have probably gotten the discrimination suit through if they were discriminated as just Black people, right? Or as women, like what are we talking about here, right? So so I think that is something to think about, right? It's not a kind of fixed in stone, right? It's legal theory, right? It's really interested in analyzing how structures are really working, right? And I think if you take that out and you think about context and structures and who's in power and what kind of, strategies are being used, you can kind of rethink what that is. I hope that makes sense and answers some questions.
Yeah, it does. That's really helpful. And one of the things that I found really helpful about it too is in referring to Roland Betancourt's work, highlighting that in different contexts, the way that the different categories work can be very different. And so the idea of critical race theory or critical race studies or pre-modern race studies, right, can be a way of asking certain questions and looking for structures, not necessarily imagining that the structures are the same everywhere, right? I think that's a very helpful way of approaching these questions, especially when you start to get into Jewish history, where the very questions of race and racialness and whiteness are also complex, right? And so that leads us up into another sort of set of questions that are being asked. One of them is, it seems that when, at some points in the talk, it seems that when you're talking about these Jewish women's experiences as intersecting race, race and gender, you're speaking of Jewishness in explicitly or even possibly solely racial terms. And so the question then is, can you talk a little bit about the conception of Jewishness or Judaism with respect to race in the pre-modern context or specifically in the English context?
I think it's because, the work that has been done on England really makes clear. I mean, there was an entire bureaucratic unit of the royal court expressly surveilling Jewish minority population. They had a say on where they could live. They had a say on where they could, how much money they were going to extract from this population. They had a say on so much, right? Even, obviously with this example about very standard family law, right? And so I think what people need to understand is the situation in England is very specific. And this is why Hang has talked about it as a racialized state. So you need these conditions to really think about it. And the way that English Christian hegemony in England is sort of organizing itself in connection to English Jews and what that relationship, that power relationship, that complete power relationship, right? They had to approve where you could get buried, right? They had they were intrinsically involved in not just, larger concerns in relationship to Jewish communities, but your everyday life, right? The sort of habits of your everyday life. And so I think if you understand that, I think the thing to understand is that groups can move in and out of being racialized, right? It really depends on power structures. Often it's sort of linked to various longer histories, but groups can move in and out of racialization depending on location, context, temporalities, etc. Right? And I think religion is one of the big areas in the pre-modern where racialization happens. And it is sort of heavily developed in relationship to European Jews, right? In pre-modern archive. I think we can talk similarly about, just even now, I would say you could talk about racialized Islamophobia after 9/11, right, in the United States, right? So, there's definitely a clear before and after, and the sort of apparatus of state, the strategies of the state, and the surveillance, the sort of all the different things. And so I think you can talk about it in the context of medieval England. with understanding its history, that, they were, Jews were in England from about the 11th century into the late 11th century until 1290 when they were expelled, right? So it's a very specific temporality, as well as this very specific logistical, bureaucratic, government, church surveillance, assemblage context, right? And I think, if you think about that, yes, Charles Mills, and I think it's interesting that in his article about racial time, because he's really kind of talking about how European time is imagined as Christian time, right? And so, of course, racial anti-Semitism is something that's going on in the Middle Ages. And he's pointing out, yes, I can see how that could be explained there, right? And then he can also see how it sort of, it happens again, right? With the Nazis and the Nazi regime in Germany in the first part of the 20th century, right? So he also identifies this kind of thing. So I think if people think about that, if they think that group racialization, people can move in and out, right? Or groups can move in and out depending on a set of contexts, and all these other factors. But especially in the Middle Ages, religion is one of the big areas where, racialization can and often did happen. So, but I think it really depends on if you sort of think through what the contexts are of the local histories, the sort of frame outs. You have to really to say that I can use Charles Mills' racialized anti-Semitism because it's England and this very specific structure, state, surveillance, all that stuff, right? And so, yes, that's what's happening. But I don't know if I can apply the same term for other parts of the history and timeline. It really depends on context. So I hope that helps and makes sense.
It's very helpful. And it just actually leads to another question, which is to ask what the category of race is doing there for your approach, as opposed to calling it a religious category or just, understanding it as the category of Jewishness in the eyes of the English. Like, is the category of race there providing something theoretically, or something substantive within the sources that lets you see it differently?
I think it does, because when I'm talking about race, I'm very specifically working through a genealogy that, and I pulled up some of the sort of key people that I'm thinking about, right? That Black feminist genealogy. I'm thinking about race as biopolitical and sociocultural, right? There is a very long conversation about this in the social sciences, even. The social sciences have shifted how they think about it. But basically, biopolitical means that, race is embodied, and you have to think about the body. And that is the reference I made in terms of, this is where the gender theory work comes in. This is also where it sort of intersects with the critical race work, right? They've been having these conversations for several decades, right? And so what we're talking about is the material turn in theory. And the material turn is basically saying that race and gender is biopolitical and social cultural, right? It's not just performance and a sort of structural thing, or it's sort of, a fiction. Yes, people can make fictions, but it also impacts your body, right? It also, eventually can harm you, potentially kill you, right? It also impacts, your health status, right? Racism is terrible for people's physical health, right? It impacts their how that will affect them, right, in various ways. So I think if you think about that, it's this sort of theoretical frame outs, right? And so what I'm occasionally get frustrated with is that this is a very long and deep theoretical area, right, with various genealogies. And I wish when people would decide that they wanted to work on race, they would just signal, all right, which genealogy, which sort of theoretical through line they're working with, right? And, and understand that to have that conversation, to go to a conference that is like critical ethnic studies, to have that conversation with the critical ethnic studies people. Similarly, if I was doing gender studies work, if I went to the National Women's Studies Association, I should be, as a scholar, expected to be able to have a cogent conversation with other feminist scholars, right? So I think that part, and I think also the theoretical lens has really interesting kind of ways to explain things, right? I mean, we're interested in the CRT theory, or I'm interested in the intersectionality theory, and because of how it really does explain how these things are happening in the material. I really feel that those two legal cases, for instance, the compounded harm, you can't sort of separate, right? Especially because this is really about how Muriel and Lucretia are dealing with they're dealing with the English court system. So the court system of white hegemony, right? Both in a kind, first, both in a sort of family law, but also then really religious law kind of situation where they're just like, no. And then the second one where it's criminal, right? It's a criminal case. So I think it really, that whole frame of intersectionality and the ways in which Crenshaw and the Combahee River Collective and other scholars really helps to kind of tease out that kind of structural analysis. And I think one of the things to understand is basically a lot of critical race theory ends up being a sort of version of critical whiteness studies. It sort of explains how white hegemonic power works, right? And how it works through institutions and structures. And, I think about how then that is actually, I sort of feel like you can't, and I think this is something that in a race before race conversation with Ibrahim Kendi, we sort of talked about this. You can't actually fight or like resist the white supremacists if you don't know what they're doing or what or how they're doing it and where they're getting their sort of mythologies and levers of power. So you actually have to understand exactly how they do things, right? And in this way, this is also how just hegemony works, right? I think similarly in terms of gender, I think we always women usually always have a sense, always know how patriarchy works in ways that, men may not realize, partly because we are always we are watching, we are observing, we understand that power dynamic, and we know how that system is, doing its thing, right? And I think that that's the other thing that I think people should take away, that it is a way to really break down how power functions and how it will target people, target groups, target in very specific ways, depending on really an enmeshed identity politics.
Well, and that is why it feels so threatening to some people, right?
Yes.
So we do have some questions also in the Q&A connecting all of these questions to the uproar over critical race theory and especially in Virginia. I think we're probably going to run out of time and not get into that right now because it's another long conversation. But as a final question that I guess might lead us there in a way, following up on some comments that you just made and also from questions that people have submitted, can you talk a little bit more about the way that whiteness is operating in the context of the case studies that you brought? So some people were asking, well, are Jews white here or not white here, right?
Oh, no, they're not. I mean, the whole point is that.
So talk a little bit about whether whiteness is a really operative thing here and how.
So basically, English Christianity and basically royal power are the sort of power structure here. They are basically like white hegemonic power. Jews in medieval England between the 11th and 13th century were, racialized anti-Semitism. They are a racialized group. And so they are basically experiencing, if you can imagine, both materially, through law, through infrastructure, through institutions, all these sorts of things. Everything from, obviously, where are we allowed to bury our dead, to interfering in legal family law, to what are we allowed to wear, right? Because this is also the place that started to require various badges, right? This is not something that was invented in the 20th century out of Nazi Germany. This is something that was invented in England, all right, in the 13th century. So they're a racialized group at this point of history, in these contexts, in this island, under these structures. And so what you see is, I think this is why the critical race theory actually really helps to unpack what is actually happening, right? And how these power moves are being worked out, right? And all the different ways this can happen, right? And the critical race theory for me helps me to identify what the power sort of move and structure and strategy is. And, it has that kind of resonance with what you see being described in US law, right? So CRT is being theorized in US law in a very specific system, but because they are naming the theories like intersectionality or post-racialism, or, sort of whiteness as property, et cetera, right? You can think about how that is working, and then think about very specific contextual, historical context situations, and then see, how that is working in that way. So that's what I would say, right? So I actually agree with Mills that, yes, definitely in medieval Europe, and definitely, I think, racialized anti-Semitism in Germany during the Nazi regime. That seems pretty straightforward and clear.
Thank you so much. There is so much more to be said, as we know, but we also know that these conversations are going to be ongoing, and I really appreciate the work that you're contributing to this, and I really appreciate that you joined us today to help spread a wider and a deeper understanding of what this work is all about. So thank you everyone for being here, and I hope to see everyone back here next week to listen to Dr. Aviva Ben-Or talk about Jews and race in the early modern Atlantic. Thanks so much, everyone.